She just came here from Panama, living in Latin America, Chile and Panama for the last 6 years, and finds that on the internet she can do her business just as well here as anywhere. So what we do a lot of times throughout the year, not just during the school year talking about economics, but during the summers we are involved with conferences, seminars, and camps, summer camps talking economics. My wife has organized conferences in Shanghai, Bratislava, Bali, various places around the world, but for the last 10 years, summer seminars at Northeastern University in Shenyang talking about market economics. And I'm with an organization that my daughter's often been with us at these camps and conferences talking economics. She followed in the footsteps at the London School of Economics. And I'm with an organization called Liberty International that holds conferences all around the world. Last year was in Mongolia. This coming summer is in Colombia. And if anyone's interested, any of the students here are interested in going to a conference in Colombia, let me know. I'll put you on the list and see if we can help you get there. One of the things that's been the driving force for me in economics is a book, The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible, A Free Market Odyssey. Normally these sell for $25 over at the HPU bookstore, but for you tonight, if you're interested, $5 if you're interested. It's a book that's been published in more than 80 editions in more than 54 languages. The most recent one was in Afghanistan. It was one of the first free market books to be published in Russia, Vietnam, China, Iran, various countries around the world. And it's been produced as a play touring Africa, Europe, and Asia, with musical productions as well, highlighting some of the lessons about free market economics. Now tonight I wanted to talk to you about economics. What can we learn from it? Everybody is well aware of the fact that the world has changed a lot in the past couple of hundred years. I mean, we get kind of used to change and things happening a lot, but it changed a lot in the last couple decades. I mean, the last couple centuries, more so than it has in thousands of years before. This chart shows the amount of wealth per person estimated throughout history, and there was really almost no change until in the last couple of hundred years, a very radical change. This has led to the possibility of an enormous improvement in living standards so that people can live long lives. I mean, it used to be that people could live to a ripe old age of 20 years or 30 years of age, and now they can live to, well, 70 or 80 years of age with improved food, clothing, shelter, medical treatment, and the rest. So we're living longer, and on top of that, a lot more people are able to live. This chart shows the number of people in the world, and the number of people here in red are the ones that are considered below the extreme poverty level. And the numbers of people, I'm pleased to say, have been going down a lot for those who are in extreme poverty. Of course, yes, there's a lot of focus on that, and it's still just as important as ever, but it's also important to recognize that a lot of changes are occurring that are making a lot of lives better in a lot of different ways. The percentage of the population in extreme poverty is down considerably. The number of people experiencing a basic education or economic literacy is considerably improved. Access to democracy is also considerably improved over the years of just 100 years ago. Vaccination and general health care and longevity, child mortality is down, so that there's a lot of good news out there because of things happening as a consequence of good economics. With all of the changes in improvements of wealth and prosperity, we find that prosperity is probably the world's best birth control because the number of people per woman being born in the world, what we call the fertility rate, is rapidly on the decline. It's on the decline worldwide. It's on the decline in the less developed countries, very dramatically so, and also in the developed countries of the world where almost all of the industrial countries of the world, here you have the OECD countries, the major industrial countries of the world, the fertility rates, and all of them, most all of them, are below the replacement rate. The replacement rate is the number of people born relative to the number of people dying, and the number of people born is less than the number of people dying. So the populations are actually declining in all of these countries. The only reason that the United States is not declining is perhaps because of immigration into the country. And a couple other countries still, but their rates of fertility are coming down. So in the future, we have had population increases, but they will taper off and probably decline worldwide in the not too distant future. Now, for most people, they're thinking, well, okay, the world is getting better off, but not the same for everybody. What makes the difference? And a lot of times the question is, well, why is there poverty in the world? That's usually the big focus. And in my opinion, it's not why is there poverty. The real question is, why is there prosperity? Because poverty is the natural state of things. That's the way the world, almost all countries of the world were, except for a very few people were at an elite status. But even today, all of you in this room have access to more prosperity and wealth than the richest kings and emperors and sultans through the great length of history. But what's making the difference? How is it that some countries do extremely well and other countries don't? It's not just culture, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just resources. It has a lot to do with economic systems. Now, my favorite way, this is quite evidenced by the difference in the amount of GDP per capita. Now, GDP per capita is not a perfect measure of prosperity and wealth. There are other ways of looking at it, but it's a simple one and an easy one to calculate, compare over time between one country and another. And by probably any measure, if you looked at the standard of living for people in South Korea versus those in North Korea, you'd find a very, very dramatic difference, as you saw between East and West Germany years ago. Now, my favorite evaluation of the causes of economic growth and prosperity is that which is done by the Fraser Institute in Canada. The Fraser Institute evaluates countries of the world on a ranking, evaluating 5 basic criteria. One is fiscal policy, essentially, what's the size of government spending and taxes? Another has to do with legal policy. How secure are contracts and property rights so that when you make an agreement with someone, you can count on it, so that when you have property, you can count on it and be incentivized by these kinds of securities in the world. How sound is the money, the monetary policy, or how much inflation is there? How much free trade is there? How much access there is to doing business with people, not next door, not just in the next state, but around the world, on other parts of the planet. It seems that the whole world has constantly been spending most of its ideas and technology and advances have been trying to bring the world smaller so that you could deal further and further away with people all over the world. Whatever they're producing, you could trade with them. And often obstacles to trade tend to make the world distant and farther apart. It undoes the advances of transportation and communication that technology has brought us. So the countries of the world have been ranked in this order, with the countries at the top. Typically, in fact, ever since they started making this analysis, it's not a measure of political freedom. It's a measure of economic freedom, which is a bit distinct. But always at the top is Hong Kong. They've never actually elected their own leaders, and they don't have the same kind of political freedom that we might expect here. But economic freedom, they've always ranked way up there at the top. And Singapore and New Zealand number 3rd. And way down at the bottom might be countries like Sudan, Libya, and Venezuela. Well, what difference does it make how you rank? Well, the amount of wealth per person is much, much greater for the countries in this high category up here, and the amount of wealth per person is much, much lower for the countries in this rank down here in the red area. Economic freedom and life expectancy. Life expectancy is also something you could expect with a better, more prosperous life. better food, clothing, shelter, and medical advances and so on, people tend to live longer in this category than they do in this category. There are measures of political rights and civil liberties tend to be much greater in the countries that are high on the ranking versus those that are low on the ranking. The economic freedom and the UN Gender Inequality Index, in other words, how much inequality is there in terms of opportunities for men and women. Well, the inequality is much less for countries that are more prosperous and successful than the countries that are low on the ranking here. Another one has to do with the income earned by the poorest 10%. And this basically indicates that it's a lot better to be poor in one of these countries than to be poor in one of these countries, because the poorest 10% are much, much more prosperous here in a generally prosperous economy and society than they are in those other countries down there. Now, I've had some experiences in my research and so on that explore some of the problems of some of these issues. Let me just bring to the forefront some problems with contracts and property and agreements. There are a lot of countries in the world where you really don't have any rights to your property. There is no certainty in contracts. I remember talking with a friend of mine from Indonesia that said that this one woman was complaining that the judge didn't side with her even though she had paid him. And he said very bluntly in open court and for the news media to report, well, yeah, you paid me, but the other guy on the other side paid me more. You know, that was the condition for getting a settlement in the courts. A lot of times people just don't have access to their property. You don't have security in it. This is a case that was came out in China. This was a case in India where people's property were taken away. And when it is, there's a lot of times frustration and anger and civil strife that blossoms at those circumstances. Now, one that I did a lot of research on, and I advise you to look it up if you're interested. There's a film called India Awakes, a number of different stories, but one of them is about the work of Trupti and Ambrish Mehta in the Gujarat province here. Now, this map shows how much of the property that the British government took when they ruled India, property that was taken away from the general landowners, the people who were working the land for centuries, and made into national parks. And when they were made into national parks, the people lost all rights to the production of their farms and of their livestock and everything. The government would take their livestock, the government would kick them off their land, the government would force them to do labor on the roads, and basically these tribals and various people in the lowest rungs of society had no rights at all to what they were producing. And they were desperately poor. They were living at the sides of the roads, eating the roots of plants and struggling to get an existence. And it was very, very hard for themselves and for their children who had very, very short lives. But Trupti and Ambrish Mehta, this is Ambrish, decided to help them out. In one instance, when the government took their livestock, they organized a couple hundred of the villagers, and they went to the government agency and just took the cattle back. They were arrested, taken to prison, but a big issue was made out of it, and finally the publicity came onto their side, and the local government, the legislature, was forced to establish a law that said, well, if you can prove that you worked the land, okay, we'll give you title to it. Little did they suspect that Ambrish, with his engineering skills and all, was able to use Google Maps and these handheld GPS devices where each farmer could plot out exactly what property that they had been working and use the Google Maps to demonstrate it. They finally, after being turned down many times, finally 80 to 90% of the farmers were given title to their land. Title to their land meant a world of difference. It meant then that they could start to develop the land. They could fence off their crops so that they wouldn't get taken by other people or by wildlife. They could build houses and storage facilities and start to utilize the the basic plant life around. They could shield the bamboo so that it could actually grow for 3 years to be big enough and strong enough for construction material that then could be a crop that they could earn from. They were able to develop indoor sanitation, running water. They were able to develop electrical connections so they could be connected to the cities and find out what the best time was to sell their crops, who they could get the best price from. They were able to get their own transportation, which gave them access to the whole of the countryside. They were able to develop methods for solar-powered irrigation. They were able to dig wells. They were able to build dams, store their grains. And this guy told me that the best thing of all, of having title to your land, was that when they went to the government agency, instead of being kicked out the door and beaten up, they were treated with respect as fellow human beings that were asked to sit down and have a glass of water. That was the biggest difference for him. And then, as a consequence of these enormous increases in their income, they were able to then school their children, both boys and girls, and send them off to higher education so they can come back as doctors and engineers and productive teachers and so on. Another factor is sound money. The importance of this is, whole courses can go over what is the value of sound money. This is a chart that shows the purchasing power of the US dollar from 1800 roughly up to the present. And we had a very stable currency, except sometimes when they printed money for wartime expenditures. But in recent years, we've seen the value of the dollar go down. If you've seen the dollar go down, imagine other currencies around the world that are much less stable than the US dollar. The problem with the falling value of a dollar, I consider, is a redistributive effect of inflation. Rising prices don't affect everybody the same. People who depend on the money that they're earning today to buy their food, clothing, shelter today, and are putting it aside to save for the future, they are the ones who lose the value. They are the ones who are essentially find a hidden tax on their wealth. People with fixed income, savers, pensioners, people who have loaned money to another and get paid back in cheaper money, and for other reasons, taxpayers too. The winners, the people who can come out ahead from rampant inflation, are debtors who get to pay back in cheaper money, people who own real estate and gold because everybody wants something that's going to keep its value and stable. Those things soar in value during times of inflation. People who are owning foreign currencies that are more stable maybe than your own currency, people with museum collectibles, and the people, of course, that get to print the money. And of course, the one thing that's notable in this is the governments are the biggest players in all of these categories, the biggest debtor of every country in the world, the biggest owners of real estate, the biggest owners of gold in most countries, the biggest owners of foreign currencies, the biggest owners of museum collectibles, and they get to print the money and spend it first before the prices go up. So it's a hidden and obscure tax on the value of these people in society, and it goes to a great extent to the people in this side of society. And you find today rampant cases of inflation. Here's the $100 trillion note, the largest denomination of currency ever printed in Zimbabwe. And of course, at the time it was printed, it was printed, there was an exchange rate of $1 trillion to $1 in the US. But soon it lost its value with such rampant inflation, you couldn't even buy an egg with it. Another factor is free trade. The Fraser Institute calculates that countries that are open to trade, just that one category on trade, are much more likely to have a higher wealth per person than countries that are closed to trade. And the growth rate for those countries is much more significant. If you're open to trade, you're much more likely to experience rapid growth. Now, this is true whether it's a poor country that's open to trade or closed to trade, where the growth rate can be 6 times as rapid if you're open to trade, or rich countries. They too benefit by being open to trade. They're 3 times more likely to benefit or to have growth rates 3 times as much as the countries that are closed to international trade. You'll find a lot of stories about this sort of thing in my book. I've tried to make economics a little bit more fun, When I one time went to a party and everything, and people said, well, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I teach economics. And people said that was the worst experience I ever had in my life. Not with Dick. I'm sure that his classes were great, but a lot of times, I'm sure you've heard people say that economics was not a pleasant experience for them. Well, there's no reason it should be an unpleasant experience. I tried to make it fun and interesting because it all affects us very, very much. There's a significant turning point in the thinking from what we call mercantilist thinking, where trade was considered bad because to buy something meant gold was leaving the country, wealth was leaving the country. And it changed with the works of some, but one notable one that you've all heard about is Adam Smith, who published his book in 1776 on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, where he rejected the mercantilist view that gold was the wealth of nations. Instead, he's saying, no, it's the consumption of goods and services that is the measure of the wealth of nations, and that's why trade benefits people. And this was the beginning of a time. Of course, there was another thing that happened in 1776. Let's see, what was that? And it marked the beginning of a change in thinking about trade. I'd like to give some examples of countries that have been in this category versus countries in the other lower categories with much less economic freedom. The Asian tigers, for example, rank, generally speaking, throughout the recent history up high, and Latin American countries all around. Recently Peru is higher now than it was, but most all the Latin American countries, much lower. Now, not only is the wealth per person higher in the countries high in the ranking, but their growth rate is higher, and that really, really matters. Not so much for you and what's visible in the next year, but if you're thinking about your parents, your children and your grandchildren over the next 50 years, it's a huge difference. And this is what the difference was for these countries of Latin America. Imagine you were trying to consider where would be the best place to live and to raise your family in 1950. Now, back in 1950, these countries had a higher amount of wealth per person in almost all of these countries than these Asian tigers. These Asian countries were very, very poor. And these countries had vast population, vast resources, vast oil, all kinds of resources that should have been great platforms for economic prosperity. But in 50 years, well, Brazil has had about 3 times the amount of wealth per person. Costa Rica, without any military expense and very stable currencies, experienced a little bit more. Mexico, with all of its vast oil expenses, had maybe twice as much wealth per person. And Venezuela, well, almost no change in all those years. But look what happened with these countries. South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. 20, 35, 40 times as much wealth per person, unrecognizable to the grandchildren of the people who first settled there and started making out a living. And the difference was their growth rate, and it was enhanced and made possible by the freedom that was available in those parts of the world. And you could say, well, maybe it was just the culture. Maybe the Chinese culture is more hardworking and so on. But if that was true, then it wouldn't be the difference between North Korea and South Korea. Here, the economic system really matters. Growth matters. If you've got a 7% growth rate, you can double your amount of wealth per person in 10 years. If you've got a growth rate of 1%, it takes you 70 years to double your wealth. And countries like Hong Kong and Singapore, that started off among the poorest countries in the world after World War II, grew very, very rapidly. And now Hong Kong is probably wealthier per person than people in the United States. And Singapore is close by there. Both of them much wealthier than their former colonial rulers of Great Britain or any other of the European countries. Another thing that's important about this is I like the Transparency International's view of the Corruption Perceptions Index. Transparency International is started by Peter Eigen in Germany as a way of trying to evaluate, not real hard data, but with some good methodology at trying to evaluate how much corruption there is involved in different countries in establishing public policy. And all the countries of the world are ranked by this Corruption Perceptions Index. A very interesting website if you want to go to it and find out. And it turns out that countries that are high on that Corruption Perceptions Index, meaning they have very little corruption, don't have as many favors to sell, to reward their friends, and as many opportunities to punish their enemies. And I think usually you'll find that the Scandinavian countries rank very, very high up here. There's a tremendous shame at being perceived as taking a personal bribe or benefit at the expense of the general public. Other countries ranking low on the list have so many rules and regulations that it's really easy to reward your friends and punish your enemies, because every time you turn around, there's a way to do that. I mean, like a pedicab driver in India that wants to get a permission to ride a pedicab, to drive a passenger around, has to probably get 20 or 30 permissions and licenses and steps through the bureaucracy. It can take a whole year to get this kind of approval. And why do they do all that? Why do they spend the money to get those things? Because they know that without that, every policeman can stop them and impound their bike and put them in jail, or levy a big fine if they don't have all that paperwork. How do you grease the wheels? You make payoffs. Well, this is sort of thing is crippling to especially low-income and poor people throughout these countries of the world. In any case, countries that are high in the economic freedom of the world index have lower levels of corruption overall, and countries that are low on the economic index have higher levels of corruption. And this also is a nice reflection of environmental performance, because usually if you're growing and you're more prosperous, you're able to tackle environmental issues much more easily than if you're not. I'd hate to say that the United States has, in recent years, been slipping on this ranking in here, and that bears some investigation as well. Okay, China moved up from here in 1980 at the bottom of the rank, down there where North Korea was, up to this kind of ranking most recently in 2000. This is the most recent evaluation of the 2017 data. Now, that's an enormous change from there to there, and yet it's still pretty low on the list. It has been sufficient overall to raise 300 million people out of poverty, which is unparalleled in human history. But still, that doesn't say too very much for the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Can you do that from there? But the major story here is not where China is as a whole. But remember, China is a big, big population, huge country, over 1 billion population. Every province of China has more people than most countries of the world. And many of those provinces of China are, if they're ranked by their economic freedom, have a ranking that's equal to or even higher in some cases than perhaps Hong Kong and Singapore. And they are the engines of growth, whereas other provinces of China are still at the bottom of the list. And what makes it possible for this massive shift from very, very controlled and tyrannical regions of the economy to economic free zones is migration. So I personally would add another 6th criteria to the Economic Freedom of the World Index. I haven't gotten them to adopt it yet, but they're sympathetic to it. At any rate, I recommend Bradley Gardner's book, China's Great Migration, in which he talks about this massive movement, especially to the economic free zones along the coast here, that were designed to replicate or imitate what Hong Kong was able to do, what Shanghai had historically done, and what was happening in Singapore. And it transformed a mere fishing village of Shenzhen from just a few decades ago into a thriving metropolis on par with Hong Kong. And Hong Kong experienced the same kind of transformation because of its economic freedom. It lifted population. This is a chart that shows what percentage of the population was in the middle class. Almost no one was in the middle class in 1980. Now in 2008, a vast majority of the population is. In Bradley Gardner's book, you find a lot of very interesting stuff about migration in general. This chart shows where people are moving around the world. Sometimes it's from country to country, region to region, but a lot of it is internal migration. And this is the domestic migration in China, the biggest migration of all. When you consider that, and he says that it's the internal migration in China has accounted for about 20 to 30% of the GDP growth from 1990 to 2010. Enormous factor in the economic growth because people are going from places where their productivity is very low to another place where their productivity is very high. So the same human being is able to produce a lot more when they go to another place. Now, the European Union was established with the purpose of opening up not just the trade of goods and the trade of money, but also the movement of people from areas of low productivity to areas of high productivity as they chose and as they sought. And about 13 million people have done internal migration in the European Union, and good, but it's nothing compared to what's happened in other places of the world. The United States has experienced about 41 million international migrants in that period of time. The world has seen 232 million international migrants during that period of time, but in China alone, more than the world, 260 million domestic migrants. And so my research indicates that those with the highest proportion of the migrant population also are ones that have done extraordinarily well with the amount of wealth per person versus countries that are most closed on those factors. Now, the world has always been, through history and prehistory, the movement of people around the planet for a lot of necessary reasons. I mean, a lot of times if they didn't move, they died. People left for opportunity, yes, but opportunity that was often driven by famines, by tyranny, or even religious persecution. We've seen that in most of the world's religions, and it's been a driving force throughout our history. America itself has seen lots and lots of migration in a sort of self-selective process. Some of the best and brightest, most diligent, hard-working people were the ones that picked up and left behind everything that was familiar to them to go to places that were unfamiliar, potentially hostile, and to take on the challenges of building a new life for themselves. In fact, the founding fathers in the United States, one of their items listed early on in the Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons they wanted to flee, to break up from England, was because the King George III was trying to stop the people who they were wanting to welcome into the country. Sadly, a lot of people came here involuntarily. You know, you all are familiar with the slave trade, where lots of people came, were brought here against their will and populated slave populations. And it's interesting to note that when they fled slavery, as people are wont to do when they're slaves and their condition is very bad, they had to flee all the way to Mexico or to Canada, because if they just fled from the southern slave states to the northern states, there were such things as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that treated slaves as property that stole itself and had to be returned to the rightful master, the rightful owner. And so the Underground Railroad sprung up with some very courageous people to defy those laws and to allow people to get to where they could once again be free, which is something we could all identify with. And it didn't matter on which side of the border the guard stood. The effect was the same, whether it was somebody trying to keep the slave in or whether it was somebody who was trying to return the slave and keep them out of some other place. We also have, actually, I consider it one of the most shameful periods of our history, where millions of people were trying to flee the tyranny of Europe under Hitler and Stalin and others during the 20th century. One of the bloodiest and egregious crimes were occurring throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. This chart shows where all of the Nazi concentration camps, where the tyrants were rounding up Jews and Poles and Catholics and anyone who resisted them, but millions of Jews, and sent them off to the concentration camps. Long before they were being rounded up, or as they were being rounded up, millions of them were desperate to try and find a way to escape. And at the Council of Evian, that was to decide on whether or not to increase the quotas to allow more Jews to escape, all the countries said, no, the quota is full. Only one country, Dominican Republic, had allowed a slight increase in the quota for Jews, but many of them were just simply returned. A lot of people know about the history of Anne Frank, very famous person because of her diary, her effort to hide from the Nazis, and then sent off to the concentration camps where she and most of her family perished. Few people know that Otto Frank, her father, twice applied to the US for visas to escape, but was turned down because, as Roosevelt would put it, our quotas are full. And of course, as a result, millions of people, not only the Franks, but millions of people who could have escaped Nazi Germany, and in fact, Hitler was quite glad to have them leave. But when other countries were rejecting them, they perished. They could have become part of the resistance against Hitler, as Einstein and Enrico Fermi. He was a Jew. Einstein fled before the doors closed. Enrico Fermi, his wife was Jewish. They fled when they saw that things were getting bad in the early 30s. And they formed the Manhattan Project, which made it possible to resist tyranny. How many more thousands of people perished because they were not allowed to leave? But there were some heroes. Oskar Schindler, you've seen Schindler's List, maybe. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a movie about a German who helped Jews to escape, and others that are less well known, but even more important. They helped many more Jews escape. There was Chiune Shinehara and Dr. He Fengshang, who signed visas as consuls in Vilnius, Lithuania, or in Vienna, Austria, to make it possible for thousands of Jews to escape the onslaught that was occurring. So if you look at Rudy Rummel's book, a former professor at the University of Hawaii, he did his book, Death by Government, an analysis of democide in the 20th century, the numbers of people who were slaughtered by their own governments. The 20th century is unparalleled, and he ranks the numbers of people who were killed very, very high. He says that under Mao's China it was 77 million, under Stalin and Lenin 61 million. So it wasn't just the Jews that were killed by the Nazis, it was other communist regimes around the world that were quite deadly. And people did escape. There was a wall, the Iron Curtain, that prevented many of them from escaping. But there were examples of people who did escape, and they were heroic. And the world cheered when that wall finally came down and people were allowed to move. And because it was the greatest embarrassment for those governments, even those governments fell, and they had to undergo tremendous change. So even today, we still have cases. A good friend of my wife and I, because she's been hosted at my wife's conferences, Iolani Park, who escaped with her mother and sister from North Korea to go to China. But of course, then the Chinese threatened, well, we'll either send you back or you become a sex slave for 2 years. And so finally, they negotiated their release, their escape, and went on to Mongolia, where they were finally repatriated to South Korea. And we joined her wedding at Battery Park across from the Statue of Liberty a couple of years ago when she finally escaped. And Shin Dong-yuk also, who was born in a prison camp in North Korea and was lucky enough to escape. But how many thousands? These are rare examples, rare exceptions, because many thousands of people are still desperate to flee, and they have troubles finding their way. In the United States, of course, we face the issue of immigration from desperate refugees from all around the world. And we find some rather embarrassing situations where cruise ships that rescued boats with refugees aboard were fined $3,000 per person for the rescue effort that they made. And so many other cruise ships then got the lesson and just looked the other way then when they saw refugees Now there is currently ongoing the debate on whether or not to build a higher and stronger wall. I'm quite impressed with the work of Penn and Teller, who engaged 3 groups of immigrants to build a wall to specification as already existed down there on the border. And they'd break them into 3 groups, one to go under the wall, one to go over the wall, or one to go through the wall. And they would give a prize to the team that got to the other side first. All 3 teams got to the other side within 3 minutes, which suggested that the wall itself wasn't very effective, but still it's a deadly venture for many people striving to go across the deserts. desperate people leaving behind something that must be really horrifying in order for them to make all these risks, and over as many as 1,000 people every year can be dying at the border. And when Walt Staten put out water along the desert to try and make a water station for people in places where they were dying, he was arrested and convicted of littering, and his conviction sentence was to spend 60 hours of community service. And he said, I thought that's what I was doing. It's interesting to me that around the world, every government has a policy to get as much oil as they possibly can. They'll explore, drill, subsidize, fight for, and claim oil everywhere because oil is so precious. And every government all around the world, officials are so eager to keep people out. They have quotas, passports, visas, fees, queues, fines, jails, and deportations and walls to keep people out, as if they are a threat and this is what is precious. In my view, it's kind of the opposite. Not that this is a bad thing, but this is definitely more precious. Every human being isn't just a mouth to feed. Every human being is a brain and hands and arms and legs with great potential for productivity and growth. Now, usually when people see immigrants in mass, they think of them as a threat. There's often this fear of a threat to jobs, a threat to religion, a threat by race, a threat to crime, a threat to terrorism, lots of fears that people have. And in my view, courage embraces the newcomer. Fear rejects the newcomer. Courage welcomes competition. Fear rejects competition. And courage embraces liberty, whereas fear rejects liberty. We fail to see often what those immigrants can become. And what they've done in the United States is to build an enormous source of wealth and prosperity, because it turns out that immigrants are much more likely to be productive entrepreneurs, producing ingenious ideas, as so many immigrants have produced valuable things that we know as commonplace elements of our commerce and society today. Immigrants founded 51% of US billion-dollar startups. Stuart Anderson says immigrant entrepreneurs are the heroes of a market-based economy, driving innovation and job creation. They started 33% of US venture-backed public companies. Adrian Furman says, why do foreigners make better entrepreneurs? First-generation migrants start businesses at twice the rate of native Americans and of second-generation migrants. Half the world's skilled migrants go to America, and in 20 years created 25% of all American venture-backed companies. The sort of people who migrate have a different pattern of motivation, abilities, and adjustment. They are hungrier and more risk-taking and more hardy. In fact, after immigrants come from other countries, very soon, many of them earn more than the median person in the country, because they take advantage of the opportunities that are often available here that are not in their own countries. It's true of Hawaii. That's why the Japanese came first from Japan, because what was offered here was so much better than the terrible hard times that they had in Japan. The Chinese, they came here. It was a very hard time. And yet these population groups, and the Portuguese who came here from abroad, came here because it offered something better. If we would look at it today and say, gee, that's really hard work, that's sweat. But it was a lot better than what they faced back home, and they came and brought with them a lot of things. So one thing that's about it is Bill Zinke lists all the good characteristics of good entrepreneurs. And he also, and Furman makes a nice parallel, saying that a lot of these characteristics are the kind of characteristics that are inimical to the people who take those great risks to go across, to go from some place that's completely familiar to a place that's completely unfamiliar, and take on risky jobs and often in a threatening environment. Says Ortega and Perry in their research, openness to knowledge, skills, and ideas from the rest of the world may be one of the most important engines of economic growth and technological advancement of our country. We show in their research that openness to immigration is a strong predictor of its income per person and works much better for immigration than for trade, even more for immigration than for trade. The Economist magazine just last month said, study after study finds a positive association between immigration and long-run economic growth, and therefore ultimately the living standards of all Americans. a lot of people are concerned, well, aren't they just coming here for the welfare? You know, and if that was true, then once they got here, they would go to the states with the most welfare, because every state has different levels of welfare. But my research indicates that it's kind of the opposite. Both the native-born and the foreign-born population, when they have the chance to move, they move from the states with the highest welfare and to the states with the least amount of welfare. Now, there are always exceptions you can find in the news and various anecdotal evidence that you can find. But generally speaking, the movement is away from high welfare states to low welfare states because, well, for one thing, to be honest, that's where the taxes are lower and it's easier to start up businesses and have economic prosperity. Some people are worried about the crime, but the evidence seems to be pervasive from multiple sources that the crime rates of immigrants, both of the documented and undocumented, is lower than the average of the native population. What about space? Don't we need a lot of space for newcomers? Well, actually, about 3% of all the U.S. land is cities and suburbs. I mean, there's a lot of land out there, but it just so happens that people like cities. That's why they move there. Throughout history and throughout the world, people have been moving, generally speaking, from the countryside into the cities because that's where the action is, that's where the specialization is, that's where the economies of scale are, that's where the comparative advantage is, that's where so much is going on that people move to cities. Some people move to the countryside, and actually there's more countryside to move to. Because in the state of New York, as the population went down, and the state of California, as the population went down, the population in New York City and Los Angeles arose. So there's more city and more countryside, open space for those who wish to choose those. Even if you look at Las Vegas, a city that was just desert before it made this one of the most thriving metropolises in America, and actually one of the most desired destinations for Hawaiians. When people in Hawaii go to the mainland, the number one destination is to the gambling casinos of Hawaii, the crowded casinos of Las Vegas. So there's a lot of room. We need not worry about a growing population hurting our wealth per capita. This chart and the research by Julian Simon reveals that human beings are the ultimate resource. They are the greatest resource. And that as the population, as indicated by the size of these dots here, as the population increases, we need not fear that we're going to lose our wealth per person, that the amount of wealth per person in the United States or in Britain and in countries around the world will experience more prosperity because of the contribution, the productive capacity under the right economic conditions that countries have to offer. So when I think about what is preferred, I prefer more economic freedom to less economic freedom. I think that it is practical. It generates a great deal more prosperity for the population as a whole. It is humanitarian. It brings a lot of benefits for the most desperate and destitute, the most impoverished of the world. And I consider it the most ethical. It is the way I would want other people to treat me if I was in their shoes. So that's my conclusion, and I open it up to questions.
I know what the answer is going to be. A quick question and then a comment, but of all those index of economic freedom,
yeah,
other than one you just, migration, let's leave that aside for a second, which do you think is the most important? If you had to choose.
That's a good point. I think probably I'd have to settle, if I had to pick out one that was the most critical, I would say secure legal and property rights. Contracts and property are essential to the growth of any country.
Because I'll never forget this, because there was a girl here who had traveled the entire Nile. And I forget, maybe Richie can remember what her name was, but she was here. And she had traveled, and she said at the end of her talk, she says, the number one, we don't need any help from you folks. We don't need give us any free goods and services. What we need is the rule of law. Every time I've seen it implemented, there's been economic prosperity. So I would agree with you. I never have forgotten what she said. She was so
absolutely. And that's what's absolutely, let's say, especially in Africa, where people don't own their own land and there's so much corruption and so on. you could give, and in fact, the charts have a chart that shows that as the amount of aid increased to Africa, the amount of prosperity declined, because it was just sucked up by rulers that then had less reason to even be concerned about their population. And no matter what you do in terms of trade, if it's going to be taken away from you right away. Yeah. So the rule of law is a very critical issue. And the rule of law is three elements. Albert Vin Dicey, a jurist, British jurist in the 19th century, said it's three elements to the rule of law. One is that no person is superior to the law. A king isn't above the law. Number two is that the law has to be applied consistently, so that everybody knows what the rule is going to be. But thirdly, he said, it had to be a law that upheld, according to British common law, it had to uphold individual rights, because you can have bad law too, and if it doesn't uphold, it violates individual rights, then it's rule of law isn't necessarily the good thing. It's a good rule of law. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question, kind of curiosity. What effect do you think the rising wealth inequality in the United States is going to have on our free market?
That's a good point, and I've given a lot of consideration to that, because actually I'm troubled by crony capitalism in this country, where where people do apply their game with politicians to get special privileges and favors. And I believe that there's this kind of favoritism that government officials give to certain players in the marketplace that accentuates this extremes in poverty and wealth. And I think that a truly free market is going to have much less of those extremes of poverty and wealth. And I think that I can understand why people are very angry about it. They say, well, and I could point to some examples. My example that I gave to you in my lectures to your economics classes were how certain agricultural interests get enormous benefits at the expense of the general population. And frankly, a free market wouldn't allow those kinds of favors, and they'd allow much more open free trade and things like that. So I'd say the fact that some groups benefit by those kinds of things, they just antagonize those who are on the out of that, and it will lead to some terrible frictions within this country when, and I wish I could do away with it. And the best way of doing away with it is expose it. Transparency is a good way, and let the general population respond to it. Well, I'm nervous sometimes about the general population because, mobs can get just as tyrannical as tyrants. I don't know if that answers the question, but it dances around it a little bit. One-on-one, we might be more blunt. Any other questions? Yes.
So what do you think, or what do you project will be the economic effects of the emergence of cryptocurrencies on third world and developing countries with unstable national currencies and corrupt government?
Brilliant question. My friend here is the guru. Where is Matthew? Oh, Matthew, here's my guru of the digital world. And if you have any questions about digital currencies, please tap him. He's great at this. I have him often speak to my classes about this too. Digital currencies, I think, have come about because governments have so much abused their inflationary powers with currencies, and people lose trust in it. So they want alternatives, and digital currencies are an alternative. I heard one person say one time, "Yeah, but Bitcoin goes up and down." I said, "Yeah, but the dollar only goes down." What you want to have is freedom of choice. I like the work of Friedrich Hayek in his denationalization of money, where in his book he calls for choice in currency as the best way of securing stable currency. Because if you could choose a strong and stable currency as opposed to the one you have to use, then people who are printing up the money are less likely to print up a lot of money if you know that you have a choice somewhere else. But then I think that governments will become nervous about that because of what they might have to lose, and they will try to outlaw digital currencies. But they're pervasive now. People find them someone I know in this row over here finds that it's a way of transferring money out of China, whereas the government's control over currencies doesn't allow movement of money into and out of a country. So there are a lot of uses for it that I think are possible. He'll give you the full story on it. Any other thoughts on this? Yes.
You mentioned how the economic wealth, wealth rate, the birth rate actually goes down. But you think about, like, for example, Japan, where it's suffering from depopulation right now, and what do you think, is the economic effect of that?
Japan is an aging population. That means that fewer and fewer people in the workforce. It's one of the most closed economies for immigration, and there's some idea afoot of trying to loosen up on that, to allow more workers to come in, and I think that would be a tremendous boost practically for the Japanese economy and on a humanitarian basis, because there are a lot of people around the world who could benefit by more openness to migration into Japan. Yeah, without it, Japan's going to continue on as a stagnant economy. They've had a very stagnant economy for the last 3 decades, really. And that's not for lack of fiscal policy and monetary policy, massive amounts of stimulus efforts, but without great success. And I think that things like openness and more economic freedom could help there as anywhere. I mean, the number one success story that I recommend to you is New Zealand. In 1984, New Zealand, after 25 years, was the slowest growing economy in the industrial world, growing at an average of 1% a year. And they, when England joined the European Union, they lost their main export market of selling lamb to England. And so instead of just producing something else, they poured on the subsidies. They borrowed from all over the world, especially the Australians, and subsidized their farmers, kept producing the same stuff until they ran out of credit. They were just, no one would lend them any more money. So there was a change of power. David Lange came into office with Sir Roger Douglas, whom I highly respect, and he implemented a policy that's outlined in a book called Unfinished Business of radical market reforms in New Zealand. They privatized most of the major industries. They ended the trade barriers. They cut the tax rates in half. They ended farm subsidies, the highest farm subsidies in the world. They ended them within 3 months, gone. And the farmers had to farm smart instead of to farm to get to the subsidies. They were soon earning more money on less land by farming smart, lean beef and lean venison and lean lamb instead of fat lamb that no one was buying. And soon they were earning more money off of less land than ever before. Their success then became from the slowest growing economy in the industrial world to the fastest growing economy in the industrial world. So I've got a lot of praise for the people and their success in free market reform. And you wouldn't have expected it from the Labour Party. And I asked Richard Preble, who was here speaking at one time a couple of years ago, I said, the Labour Party, you don't normally expect that from free market reforms from the Labour Party. He says, as a Labour Party member, I was always against privilege. And every government favor and program was a privilege to some at the expense of the many. And that's why he became a super free market advocate. So read the books of Sir Roger Douglas is the best story about radical market reforms that brought about astounding success. That's why New Zealand's now right behind Hong Kong and Singapore on that Economic Freedom of the World Index, has been for 20 years now. Yes?
Is there any economic effect on the countries that people are migrating from?
Well, good point. When my daughter left here to go to England, I thought the economy took a huge hit. Well, you could say so, but yeah. And there's the people who say, well, there's the brain drain if somebody leaves. Well, I think they leave because the policies are bad and not welcoming their brain. And they go where they could make the most use of their brain. And they go back, as they did with Ireland. The Irish left Ireland when it was inhospitable towards market ideas. But when they changed their policies, lowered their taxes, became more welcoming of new ideas, the Irish went back to Ireland. You know, they'll come back, they'll follow wherever the policies welcome them and treat them with respect. And so, yes, the country as a whole is hurt by brains leaving a country, but it's not their fault. They're going to make the best use of their time, energy, and talents, and they'll be back if those policies change. And actually, they can bring a lot back. They bring their contacts, they bring their knowledge, they bring their skills. The people of Singapore were leaving Singapore for many years, and then in recent years, now they're going back and taking with them a lot of what they learned. And also, I'd have to say that there's an enormous benefit from remittances. You know, remittances, this is what, let's suppose that you went to another country and then you sent money back home because you earned a lot more there than you were earning back home. Remittances worldwide is about 3 times as much as all overseas development assistance, all the foreign aid. 3 times as much is remittances, and it's a lot more effective. Consider some of the criticism of foreign aid is that it's money taken from poor people in rich countries and given to rich people in poor countries. Because governments to governments, they don't really appreciate the money they're taking. They don't really appreciate what's being done with it when it's given. But if you earn money, you know how hard you worked for it, and you give it to somebody, you're giving it to them because you believe that they can appreciate it and do good things with it. And they appreciate it because they know you and they appreciate what it meant to you. And so this personal connection and remittances are much more likely to be productively used in building a business, building a home, and doing things of productive use when it's done voluntarily through people with these kinds of connections. When it's involuntarily, it's often, I think, harmful. As Bill Clinton acknowledged there's a film called Poverty, Inc. on Netflix, you can look it up. He apologizes for what he did. He says, I did it, it's my fault, it was a big mistake to take a huge amount of rice from America and unload it on the Haitian market. They had troubles, but when we unloaded all that rice, we helped the Haitian people with some rice, but we drove out of business all the Haitian rice farmers. So now they were dependent on the United States for this rice. And so, you know, even maybe with the best of intentions, it can have adverse, harmful effects. I sometimes get off the question. But you had a question.
Yes, you said something that I really like, that it takes courage to be open to competition from migration, and also takes fear to reject, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure that we all here are super brave and have a lot of courage, but is there any other incentive that you can think about to motivate the people that are here, like local, for example, and to see competition as something good, that is not seen like, oh, I want to be, I want to have courage, I want to be open to competitions? What would you tell those people that they don't want to have courage?
Yeah, I had a student from Germany. His name was Sebastian. I don't, for the moment, I can't remember his last name, but Sebastian said, we have a saying in Germany, if you're afraid of competition from the immigrants, the problem is with you, not with the immigrant. The problem is that you don't have the right to the job if somebody else can do it better. I mean, I feel like if somebody else can do my job better, they have a right to it. So competition is a huge incentive for me to get better at it, to be a good teacher, a good, or speaker, or whatever I do. And that's the same, I think, the value of competition is hugely positive incentive. And I don't know if that particularly answers your question, but
that also will come out of like, I don't know, maybe not fear, but concern that you don't want to lose your job, right? Because you don't want anyone to beat you. Yeah. But that's how to be open to this competition and to have this idea that it will affect in a positive way to the economy of the country. Let's say you as a teacher, as an economic teacher, how would you welcome this new economic teacher, and you don't see him as a threat?
Well, I mean, I think it's very natural to think that somebody who comes along and might be willing to do the job, at a lower price, or even better than me, I'm going to feel threatened. But I shouldn't have the power of my fear to prevent him from having a job, because the employer should be able to choose who does the best with their work. And the greatest example of this was the Chinese Exclusion Act. you know, when they were building this transcontinental railroad from San Francisco up to meet at Ogden Point with the Union Pacific Railroad, Central Pacific, and they were racing because the government was giving them a lot of land on both sides of the railroad, faster they could go. They get more of a subsidy. But there were no workers in California, very few that were willing to work on the railroad. So they hired a lot on contract labor. They went over to China and they said, "Are you willing to work?" And they said, "Yeah, the price, you're paying us a lot. The conditions are really bad here." So they came over by the thousands to work on that railroad. They did the 4Ds, really dangerous work. It was dark at night. It was what are the 4Ds? But it has to do with at low pay, all the conditions were really harsh, but they built the railroads. And what happened right after that, the white laborers didn't want that competition. They said, no, they shouldn't be allowed to work. We passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented them from coming to the country. Well, it was a great harm to those people. They were human beings just like any other human being. It was great harm to them. And it did them a great disservice. The country had in those days very, very racially discriminatory policies against the Chinese. And the worst of all was just preventing them from coming in the first place. And I can sympathize. People didn't like their jobs being given, it's not their job, a job being given to another person who was going to work harder, late at night, darker, less pay and all that sort of thing. But the solution isn't just to eliminate the competition. The solution is to get better at other things, be more innovative, take advantage of the things that are your skills. Well, you know the language better. You have learned more skills. You can do lots of things. But it's easier just to eliminate the competition. That's true of any agricultural business. You say, it's easier for me to just get the Congress to pass a law outlawing my competition than it is to get to be better as a farmer and produce better at a lower cost with more efficiency, with more variety.
We have to end it there.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Yeah, good. If you'd like some.
Every one of my grandchildren is in.
Great.
Fantastic.
I want everyone in my grandchildren.